Hello, welcome everyone. We'll go ahead and do a slow start here. It looks like about 80 people have joined so far, and we're expecting a number more to join here in the next few minutes. My name is Brian Dean. I'm the head of energy efficiency and cooling here at Sustainable Energy for All. And we have panelists joining you from Vienna, Austria, from the East Coast of the United States and from the West Coast of the United States. So we've got a long geographic range from all of us as participants. So thank you to the panelists for joining. The way that we're going to be working this webinar is we'll try to be within about an hour, and you will all be on mute, and all the participants will be on mute, and we'll have a chat function, which I see that Pradeep has already used to welcome everybody here. Go ahead and use the chat function to ask questions throughout the webinar, and we will have a slot at the end, whether it's a question to a specific panelist or more generally. You can use the chat function. Also, we welcome you to email us at coolingforall@seforall.org. For any further questions and discussion that you'd like to have with us. So with that, next slide, Ben. So the way that the structure of the webinar is being set up is we have an introduction to go over the agenda. Then we'll go through, and Ben Hartley will be leading us through the next 3 sets of items, which is the challenges in access to cooling finance, the opportunities in access to cooling finance, and of course the recommendations. And then we'll have a discussion where we have Alan Miller, who is a senior consultant and an advisor to us at the Cooling for All Secretariat. Helen Picot, who is with the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program and also an advisor to us at the Cooling for All Secretariat. And Olivia Caldery, who we're fortunate to have on staff at SE for All, and she's the head of our energy finance work. And so we're bringing 3 different sets of perspectives during the discussion. And then time permitting, we will have questions and answers. So next slide, Ben. So this is what the timing should look like. So we have quite a bit of time dedicated to the panel discussion and then questions at the end. So with that, I'll hand it over to Ben Hartley, who is one of our energy efficiency specialists here on the Cooling for All team at SE for All.
Thanks very much, Brian. Hi, my name is Ben Hartley, and I'll walk you through the next part of the presentation. And while I do that, I'll take myself off on video. There we go. Okay, so thank you all very much for joining. So first, a brief introduction for those who have not had a great deal of exposure to access to cooling. It has been labeled a blind spot for energy systems, but enabling access to sustainable cooling is also at the basis of achieving many SDGs. For example, cold chains prevent food waste for some of our most nutritious goods. They also keep vaccines cool from import to delivery to rural health clinics. It's also necessary to keep workers productive as temperatures rise. So our work at SE for All focuses on enabling access to sustainable cooling for those who are most vulnerable because they lack it. And for us, what is measured can be managed. And this begins with a global tracking exercise based on risk due to a lack of access to cooling. Between 365 million rural and 680 urban poor living in hot climates, we at SE for All have tracked over 1 billion people who are at highest risk due to a lack of access to cooling. So those are on the left side of the screen there. The lower middle income, of whom there are 2.2 billion living in hot climates, are on the brink of purchasing a cooling device and are at medium risk. The consequences of their purchasing options being limited to inefficient devices or those with high upfront costs could have profound impacts on energy systems. In the middle income, 950 million who are at less risk, but this is an important category for awareness as they may be able to move to more efficient devices. So another important component of our efforts here is to drive a needs-driven and systems-level approach to access to cooling, such that we can address the entirety of cooling needs for vulnerable groups across human comfort and safety, agriculture, food and nutrition security, and health services. So that's why, in partnership with Heriot-Watt University, we developed the Cooling for All Needs assessment you can see in the top left part of your screen. This is a tool to help measure cooling needs in these 3 critical areas, and they're guided by guiding questions. And for more information, you can check our website. For more information on this tool, you can check out our website at seforall.org/coolingforall. So it's within that context of tracking the challenge and developing new resources and tools to address it that we at SE for All produced a knowledge brief on how we finance solutions to the access to cooling challenge. So a quick introduction to that knowledge brief, a few important things to note and keep in mind as we run through the presentation. Those cooling needs I just described can vary dramatically. It depends on who you are, where you live, what your occupation is, and income level, among others. This differentiation means that a wide range of financial products, instruments, and approaches will be needed. Mapping finance needs and market gaps can really help us overcome some of the financing barriers. And lastly, the financial tools and sources will be differentiated and also depend on a variety of factors. For example, the likelihood of commercial returns. So in the brief, we begin with 4 challenges, 4 primary challenges. First is the diversity and the complexity of cooling needs and the types of markets and finance that may be necessary. So this links back to what I was talking about before with the Cooling for All Needs assessment. For human comfort and safety, a big challenge is lowering the upfront costs of efficient cooling devices so that they can be accessed. Agricultural cold chains need market stimulation, and concessional finance and public investment is necessary on the health side. The second challenge is also diversity and complexity, but of funding, and specifically funding instruments. Noting that not every type of finance or funding mechanism will be relevant and suitable for all cooling solutions, the instruments used will need to be targeted. In addition, they need to be matched with the type of financing party and the expected beneficiaries. There is a range of instruments, and each can vary with the stage of a project or enterprise. So to understand this a bit better, one of the things the knowledge brief did was explore commonly understood gaps or barriers to climate finance and translate them into access to cooling. And you can see the top of that chart, or the top half of this screen, is the headline of a larger table that is included in full in the knowledge brief, and we encourage you to check that out. On the bottom, we provide some examples of access to cooling finance by solution and need, delineating between passive or non-electrical solutions and energy-related solutions across those areas of need, and you see a few examples there. Next, so 2 other big challenges that were identified at the top of the brief. The fact that the financial sector is typically locally specific and dominated by risk-averse sources of capital, meaning there's a challenge to attract capital outside of limited public and philanthropic sources. And the fourth is the fact that we don't yet have a formal tracking effort to understand access to cooling finance. You'll hear a bit more about this later, but tracking energy access finance has helped understand where the gaps are in order to direct new investment, something that would be helpful for access to cooling. So next, I'll quickly run through some of the opportunities identified before coming to the recommendations of the finance brief. So you can see them on your screen. I'll run from left to right. And first is the consideration of access to cooling by the climate funds. This could be dedicated finance or finance through nexus issues that consider access to cooling, for example, energy access. There are promising signs, early signs from a few of these funds that are included below: the Montreal Protocol, the Green Climate Fund, and the Global Environmental Facility. So that should be the implementation fund of the Montreal Protocol. Second is the coordination of the refrigerant replacement with energy efficiency, which can reduce operational and procedural complexities. So new opportunities may in fact arise from the Climate Investment Platform, which was launched last summer, or at the end of last summer, pardon me, at the Secretary General's Climate Summit. Third is leveraging public funds with blended finance, which can increase the impact of public and philanthropic support. But it's likely that it needs to produce cash flows. Fourth is technical assistance, which is needed to improve the environment for investment and to unlock capital. So we have 3 more. For the next one is the use of national cooling plans and their processes to prepare for finance, including using this process to coordinate across multiple ministries to apply for centralized financing. See that as a key part of the process here. It would be best if they can also use this process to clarify needs and financing requirements by sector, as we've indicated above. Next is linking with nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement and national adaptation plans. We've seen good signals, for example, from the World Bank on this, as well as from the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program with a new NDC support facility. And then finally, the final opportunity is bulk procurement, which can help address issues of scale and overcome barriers that include, for example, that small dispersed transactions are typically more costly to process. So finally, I will conclude with the recommendations. So the first recommendation of the brief was that we need to track, report, and share experiences. We have to track access to cooling finance. Because we're in a nascent stage, there is an opportunity to get ahead of this, but ideally in a broad partnership that consolidates on a common definition of what access to cooling finance is, and its, for example, its relationship to energy access. Next recommendation is linking national cooling plans to the Sustainable Development Goals and the NDCs under the Paris Agreement. This is important for moving beyond a focus on air conditioning and refrigeration, and ensuring these plans are also vehicles to realize SDG benefits. With the NDC review this year and into next, it would appear, they can also support emissions reductions. The third recommendation is the continued success of the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program. So I think it's delivered catalytic finance in its first phase, and as it moves forward, can really show how innovations in business, policy, and technology can be scaled. But the view in the brief is that multilateral and bilateral donors should contribute to the continued success of KSEP, in addition to the philanthropic support that it received in phase 1. So next, 4 and 5 you will see are similar. We need more evidence of the benefits of investment in both health and agricultural cold chains. In agricultural cold chains, a lack of data is a real barrier to investment. And in health, the challenge is a touch more nuanced. It's to link the benefits of investment to those access to cooling outcomes and bring those communities together. And then finally, the coordination of the refrigerant phase down and efficiency improvement funding. Finance for these 2 challenges will be more effective if it's coordinated. Timing is critical, and with fast action, we can realize a wide variety of benefits, both for the Paris Agreement, the Kigali Amendment, and the SDGs. So this is the conclusion of the presentation. Thanks very much for bearing with me. At this time, I will pass back over to Brian Dean, who will help lead us through the next phase.
Great. Thanks, Ben. This is excellent. And I'm already starting to see some questions come in. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Ben. And what we're going to do is we're going to open up this next bit, which will be discussion amongst Alan, Helen, and Olivia. And during this process, I want to encourage more questions to come in. And as we have some prepared questions for the discussion, and then we will go into answering some questions that come in online. And we're going to switch back over to video here shortly so that you can see each of us as we're talking. Ben, just next slide real quick so that people can see. You can continue to contact us also through the email address right there, coolingforall@seforall.org. But please do ask questions in the chat box. Formal introduction. So you see Alan Miller. So he's Senior Climate Finance and Policy Consultant and Advisor to the Cooling for All Secretariat. And Helen, you can see, is the Head of Access to Cooling and Strengthening of Efficiency for the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program, and also Advisor for the Cooling for All Secretariat. And then you can also see Olivia, who is the lead for all of our energy finance work at SE for All, and has a long experience in the climate and energy access finance field. So great to have you all as panelists here. Let me start off with Alan. So Alan, you have a long background in the Montreal Protocol and climate finance related to climate finance and development more broadly. So can you help us unpack why different cooling needs will necessitate a broad variety of financial solutions, and why access to cooling is more complex than other challenges?
Thanks. First, just let me start by complimenting SE for All for the role that they've played in raising awareness generally about issues of sustainable cooling, and recognizing that it was only in 2018 when SE for All published Chilling Prospects that the significance of this issue was really, for the first time, brought to international attention, and its linkages to the Sustainable Development Goals emphasized. So also a very quick correction. Ben and I have just exchanged on this. It's the Global Environment Facility, not environmental. And the only reason I mention it is that I worked there for a number of years. I think Ben's presentation and certainly the report itself do a very good job of highlighting the extraordinary scope and complexity of sustainable cooling issues and needs. And if you consider the more typical aspects and objectives of climate finance, say, for example, a renewable energy project, you have a relatively clear set of actors, project developers, a very specific and well-developed body of technology with solar and wind energy, etc. And even the same is true of many aspects of energy efficiency. So if you're focused to take one subset of cooling needs, improving the efficiency of appliances, that too is a pretty well-developed set of issues and challenges. You know the actors and the manufacturers, you know what technologies are commercially available, and you know what the financing sources are for that set of products. When you encompass the full range of health, agriculture, differences in urban slum conditions, it's really much, much more complicated. And attempting to design one-size-fits-all solutions is really not possible. You have to deal as well with very different circumstances. So the difference between what can be done in a growing new city in China with opportunities for regulating new buildings, regulations, is very different from the conditions as SE for All has described in the urban slums of Lahore. And attempting to come up with solutions for such a diverse and wide-ranging set of sectors really, I think, has been part of raising the awareness. Just to give one other aspect that illustrates the kinds of challenges that you have, there are a number of countries, including India, a couple of years ago, that started with national cooling action plans. And the presentation aptly recognized the importance of those plans. However, when you look at the document, what you see is you encompass 5, 6, or 7 different ministries of the government in order to implement and focus on those different sectors. You have the Environment Ministry, the Energy Ministry, Agriculture, Health, and in order to try to have one all-encompassing approach, it's extremely difficult, even just from a government policy standpoint, much less from coming up with specific financial solutions. In addition, you have different levels of government. So many of the issues are at the city level, and then you have many issues which require public finance because there's no commercial return, as with much of public health. So I don't want to go on too long, Brian, so I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, those are very, very useful insights, and we'll we'll get some more from you. Also, be remiss if I didn't thank you for your support in terms of the writing of the financing brief. I think that was really tremendous having your insights involved with that brief as well. So
It was great experience. Thank you, Brian.
Yeah. So with that, want to turn it over to Helen. And the question we have for you, Helen, is, can you describe the importance of early philanthropic investment in access to cooling? And of course, KSEP has been a big part of that. So what does KSEP view as its major wins in access to cooling and in its finance window in particular?
Sure, thanks, Brian, and seconding my congratulations to the team on getting out the finance brief. So philanthropy is really quite flexible funding. It's not it's not public sector money. It's private funds, and therefore we really in the sector have a lot of discretion over where we spend it, and that means we can be the first movers in areas that perhaps governments or commercial investors are not prepared to take the risk on. And I think that risk appetite is really where we can have the most impact. And so I like to think of a lot of our funding as seed funding and being the first mover. And certainly in the access to cooling window, a lot of the work we do, particularly trying to help support the SDGs, we only have 10 years left on the SDGs, it's gone very quickly, but we're running out of time. And so some of these more experimental and maybe systemic ways of thinking about solutions are important. So just to give a couple of examples and maybe some successes, as you said, from our work in the window 4, which is access to cooling. One example of seed funding is our Million Cool Roofs Challenge Prize. And we know that challenge prizes are a form of innovative financial mechanism that can lever a lot more results. And actually we have 10 teams working towards this final prize now, 10 shortlisted teams. Over half of them are engaging with local governments and trying to get public funds on top of the small seed funding we've given them to maximize their impact in terms of engagement and the actual physical work, but also maximize the funding they have that can be longer term than what we can put in. So for example, in South Africa, the National Energy Development Institute is partnering with local municipalities to paint cool roofs across several districts. And then in Indonesia, Tangerang municipality has formally partnered with the mayor over there. And actually some of the results there are really striking. There's a factory, a cookie factory in Indonesia that has over 5,000 workers. And so far their results from painting the roof with solar reflective paint are reductions in daytime temperatures of 5 to 10 degrees during the working day. So this really has huge human benefit, SDG impact. In terms of the finance window, window 3, which my colleague Shilpa Patel leads here at KSEP, the focus of window 3 is really to try and institutionalize cooling efficiency investments across the finance sector. And we work with a range of investors ranging from MDBs, also national development banks and private and commercial investors. And so far they have 35 investments in the pipeline, which are deemed to be financially sustainable. So that's leverage, they'll be independently able to return for their investors. And so that's our leveraging impact so far, and the actual financial numbers from that leverage will come through probably by the end of the program. One major win that I'd like to talk about is the Efficient Clean Cooling Program under the World Bank's ESMAP program, which is their Energy Sector Management Assistance Program. And this is basically institutionalizing cooling efficiency into ESMAP's business plan through to 2024. And we think it's the largest institutional investor that's focusing on cooling, which is far beyond the scale of what KSEP's philanthropic funds cover.
Yeah, it's nice when your money multiplies, and certainly the World Bank has the opportunity to help with that. Yeah, thanks Helen, and thanks for all your support from the KSEP side. It's obviously been critical to move this cooling story forward. So with that, I'll turn it over to Olivia. And Olivia, given your experience in climate and energy access finance, the cooling is a little bit of a different story, but can you give your perspectives on the risks and challenges on access to cooling finance that we might face at this early stage that we're at right now? And what do you view as promising coordination efforts that might accelerate finance flows, which is critical?
Thanks very much, Brian. Hello, everyone. Great to be part of the conversation, and thank you very much for your interest in the webinar. I really commend the Access to Finance cooling brief to those of you who haven't read it yet. It's really great work and really moves the conversation forward, so I'd commend it to you. Brian, I'll try and answer your question in two parts. One is by going back to some of the barriers that Ben walked us through his presentation, and I think they follow on quite nicely from Alan's comments. And secondly, to perhaps just suggest some ways that we could address those challenges. So coming back to the barriers and challenges from a finance lens, we've touched on a couple. One is information and data. So it's difficult for a financier or an investor to make a commitment without knowing what they're investing in or what the ecosystem is to support that investment. So data gaps, super challenging from a financing point of view. So we're measuring with data, but we're also informing risk assessment and appetite and risk retirement. So that's an important challenge that needs to be addressed for the sector. The second one is around technology. Alan alluded to this earlier, and the nascent stage of some of the solutions that are being looked at. So again, financiers, with the exception of innovative seed funders, such as KCEP, naturally risk averse. So they need to know what they're funding. And in a technology sense, we might draw an analogy with more mature technologies. Alan mentioned solar and wind before. If we think about the process that the solar PV sector went through, for example, over some decades to get the technology to where it is today, financiers have followed that path as well. So we need to go through a similar process in developing solutions to cooling challenges, but also to get financiers on board, get them or help them to get to know that technology and those solutions so that they're more comfortable financing them. Same for business models, to the extent that sort of innovative companies and particularly SMEs are developing business models to roll out solutions. SME finance is hard at the best of times. It's even harder if the business model is new. And again, need to bring the finance sector along and inform them about why this solution is differently, how it can generate cash and how it can be a sustainable solution that's profitable for financiers who are looking for financial returns. Another area of risk that Ben touched on in the presentation is that a lot of the challenge that we're seeing in cooling, as people on this call know much better than I do, is in the developing world and in emerging markets. So that is another layer of risk for financiers to have to come to terms with and address in order to make commitments and follow through with investments. So that's an extraordinarily difficult one for financiers. It can be mitigated through various risk instruments typically offered by public sector financiers and development finance in particular, but that is a layer of risk that we need to be aware of as a major challenge to finance flowing to cooling solutions. I just want to also touch on a couple of demand side risks that we need to address if we want to get finance moving into the sector. Affordability was touched on very nicely in Ben's presentation. That's a big one. So unless there is a cash flow or a situation in which end-use beneficiaries can repay, then it's going to be very, very difficult to make a case, certainly for commercial finance to step in and fund this activity. If they can't see a ready return, that is going to be a difficult one without sustained public sector support. So we need to address the affordability challenge on the demand side, which is obviously of huge import to the ultimate beneficiaries of the solutions we're looking at in cooling. One particular dimension of that I want to touch on is access to finance for women. That is another layer of challenge that we need to be aware of. Women in many countries don't have access to finance of any kind in the same way that men do, perhaps through laws that prohibit them opening a bank account, for example, prohibiting them from owning property with which to provide as collateral security for loans, etc. So there are some unique challenges faced by women that need to be uniquely addressed. So that's the sort of the black hat view, I guess. Addressing the challenge, so policy signals super important. Ben has touched on cooling plans, NDCs, and linking them to the SDGs. To the extent that policy signals are there, they provide a pathfinder to investors and financiers. So if financiers can get comfortable with the fact that there is solid, sound policy in place that's going to be sustained over a number of years, that is going to create a more conducive environment to investment. Climate funds and technical assistance, that was touched on. So great news that the climate funds are raising internally their own awareness of cooling solutions and how they might approach the sector. Great to know that there is financial innovation being supported through KSEP, for example. Another organisation that we work with closely, the Climate Policy Initiative, runs a climate finance innovation lab that seeks to incubate new financing solutions and support them through to market deployment. I just want to touch briefly on the climate investment platform that Ben mentioned. That is a new initiative announced last year that seeks to bring players together in the energy finance space initially and ultimately to be brought into the climate finance space to support better target setting by governments, better policies and regulations to support energy sector reform, and ultimately financial de-risking. So I just want to sort of put that out there as an initiative that's in play at the moment, and hopefully that can help move the sector by convening and bringing all relevant demand and supply side players together. So I'll stop there.
Great. No, thanks, Olivia. Those really good sets of insights, and good to see that we can use the experiences from the broader energy access, renewable financing world, and recognizing where we are in the early stage, and using some innovative tools like KSEP is doing, and certainly there's more for us to do in this early stage. So thank you for that. Alan, sort of building on that, there are many promising innovative ideas that can be used to meet sustainable cooling that are still at the early stage, being tested, very small scale. What can be done to accelerate the learning and the replication of those initiatives that are the most successful, and how can that lead to long-term investments in them?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And first, I wanted just to start by acknowledging that the linkages between different sources of finance are such that relatively small sums from groups like KSEP, and here I'm looking at Helen's image, have a surprising impact. And you noted that the KSEP funding is helping to leverage the World Bank. And I'm a World Bank alum, and I still do some work there. And I can tell you that the contributions that KSEP made to SMAP have been extremely important in helping to engage this very large institution, the World Bank. But in turn, the activities of the World Bank Group and the other development finance institutions are similarly very minor relative to total private flows, investment and capital. And yet there are many efforts to try to leverage much more effectively from the DFIs to private investment, to de-risk. And some of those issues, Ben didn't have enough time to go through them all in detail, but just to alert your audience, if they haven't read the brief, I think there's some good discussion there. But just to close on the importance of what KSEP is doing, there is this remarkable financial value chain in which the inputs from the philanthropic community that help to bring about efforts by development finance institutions who are not as risk averse, who in turn can bring about initiatives from the commercial sector. So we're starting to see social impact investment growing very rapidly. So coming back to your question about accelerating new technologies, I would actually say new technologies and new business models. So to me, one of the other initiatives that deserves some attention that's very recent, in fact, too recent even to be included in the finance brief, was the evolution of the energy as a service model that the Global Lab that Olivia referred to had agreed to support. And just last month, they announced 5 winners from different countries with different partners that, to me, is a perfect illustration of what we're talking about. It's not just a new technology, but finding new ways to accelerate the uptake and acceptance of things. So how can we do that more effectively? Well, ironically, I think one of the models that we are now all witnessing is the response to COVID-19. And that is the recognition that if we were to wait through the normal channels for vaccine testing, development, and federal national government approvals, we would easily be looking out 18 months to 2 years. And given the current state of the global pandemic, that's clearly not acceptable, much less desirable. And consequently, many innovative approaches are being incorporated in how to simultaneously and more rapidly develop, test, and then disseminate lessons learned. And it's, again, a kind of a value chain. And I think we have been seeing more early stage risk capital through things like the Global Lab, which are great, through competitions of the sort that Helen mentioned. And that early stage, I think, is gradually, although still inadequate, getting more attention. The issues that I still think are not getting nearly enough recognition have to do with evaluating and replicating, scaling up, and disseminating lessons learned. For example, if you look at some of the Green Climate Fund projects, a few of which do have cooling elements, they're often 10 to 20 year projects. And that's realistic in terms of what's normally required for financing. But I think we're really going to need to engage more effectively, and perhaps through the climate investment platform, which I only learned about through this brief, so thank you for that. But there needs to be internal discussions. So each of these entities, for example, has an independent evaluation group. I think those groups collectively could be looking at ways to report much earlier and perhaps, again, looking at the model of the virus and saying, maybe this is not a pandemic, but it is a climate crisis. And the ability to meet the SDGs as well as the Paris climate goals will depend on whether we can find ways to do that more effectively.
Great. Yeah, perfect. Thank you for all those additions. And it's that early stage and being able to replicate and accelerate, I think is incredibly critical. Helen, on your side, I've got a question a little bit more on the policy angle. With you as the head of both access to cooling and strengthening for efficiency at KSEP, what do you think that the implementation of the National Cooling Action Plans, a strategy document that countries are developing, will tell us about finance needs for access to cooling? And what are the best reasons for countries to include access to cooling in their NDCs, their nationally determined contributions?
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, as you say, I lead both sort of some national policy work as well as the sort of more sustainable development work at KSEP. And there are really strong links between the two. I think what Alan said is completely true. We need a long-term perspective, both for decision makers and policymakers and governments, but also investors, and a strong investment signal, which is what Olivia was saying. Setting policies is really helpful for markets. And so with national cooling plans, the work going into them, the methodology behind them, obviously involves consideration mostly of the information that's available, which tends to be which AC units and fridges have been bought. Obviously, you at SE4 and your partners are doing a lot of work on how to quantify the gap in access to cooling. But when it comes to the funding needed, it's a bit of a black box, as you say. And so for me, I think the actual process of writing a national cooling plan and drafting it does tell governments quite a lot. They can start to put numbers around, okay, well, if this many people don't have access to electricity and are in a very high ambient temperature region of our country, some countries have very disparate temperatures, for example, Mexico or India, then we start to get a sense of the number of people. But when it comes to the financing, I do think that's more when it comes to implementation, actually looking at the solutions and maybe doing a solutions mapping, whether it's on-grid, off-grid? Are we looking at sort of central solutions, for example, in the agricultural cold chain, or much more distributed solutions, which might be more the case in medical vaccine provision and cold chain for that? You know, often that's going to be very distributed in rural communities to get to last mile, looking much more at sort of solar direct drive systems and sort of bridges that aren't linked to the grid. And when you have a solution and a technology that you've identified, then you can start to put a price on things and sort of aggregate up. But with that, there's a huge black box around this, and I think we're going to see a lot as the front-running countries. And for those of you who don't know, India has already published a national cooling plan, and then some other countries funded by KSEP have published. So China is the largest, but also some lower income countries such as Lebanon, Trinidad and Tobago. I should say as well, we've, just to plug, we launched last week our third year annual report, and there's plenty of information in there about our work on national cooling plans. And one thing we really advocate is that countries not only write a national cooling plan if they're willing and able to, but try and link cooling into their nationally determined contributions, which are the climate mitigation and adaptation commitments in the UN climate regime. And 2020, in theory, you know, they've pushed back COP26 to next year, but right now is the time that countries are being asked by the UNFCCC to recommit on their mitigation targets. This happens every 5 years. It's 5 years since the Paris Climate Agreement. And this is really an opportunity to sort of have a national level commitment on cooling that really links to climate targets, it links to development targets, and it tries to overcome those silos, which Alan, you mentioned earlier, quite rightly. I mean, this is something we see all the time in our work. You know, one ministry will work on the F-gas transition, one ministry is working on climate, one ministry is working on industrial policy, but all of those different things have to come together. Of course, if you're a very low emitting country, it's a big ask to ask a country to increase their mitigation ambition, especially, you know, the US where I live has pulled out of the climate agreement. So it is a very sensitive and politicized issue, but I think when it comes to cooling efficiency and why should a country include it in their NDC, I would go back to some of the simplest arguments which remain true. You know, if you have strong cooling efficiency policies and practices in your country, then you save energy costs for both your businesses that operate, but also your consumers who might be very energy poor. Emissions reductions and cleaner air, you know, plenty of countries all over the world still rely on coal and certainly rely on natural gas and highly polluting peaker plants, for example. You know, by reducing the peak load of air conditioning, and of course everyone turns their air conditioner on at the same time in a city because it gets hot everywhere at once, you can perhaps reduce the need to build a new gas peaker plant or a coal plant, and that could have, you know, great you know, climate benefits, but also health benefits for your population. And I know that air quality is a really strong topic of debate right now as we're under lockdown, and they're clear. I'm in Oakland, there are clear skies outside my window that I don't normally see. And then, you know, so grid reliability and energy security. And then finally, of course, the access to cooling benefits that SE4 works on. So food, access to nutrition, medicines, reduced risk from heat waves, and sheltering your population from very hot conditions. You know, so those things remain true. That's their win-win benefits. And by really concretely and I guess granularly thinking through what are the cooling efficiency policies that can go into an NDC update, a country could both strengthen their mitigation ambition on paper, because if they do have commitments within the Montreal Protocol, they're not automatically counted in the UNFCCC, and so they might be sort of leaving tons on the table, as it were, in terms of what they can get recognised for, but also just strengthen their plans and the chance or the likelihood that they'll be able to deliver on their mitigation plans that they have. And we have just launched in February a new funding window called the NDC facility, which is going to be up to $12 million, really looking for TA providers to work with governments and together put in a proposal. And a key criterion is that governments do commit that they're going to put an efficient, clean cooling or access to cooling measure into their NDC. And that's sort of a prerequisite for applying for the program. And there's more information on our website.
No, thanks, thanks, Helen. Great to see, that you guys are really helping to push the barriers out of the way in terms of the policy side, and it's this black box. I was interested in the beginning, and it really gets to the question that I have for Olivia, which is, on this finance side, on this tracking side, how is it that the banks and the finance community knows where and how to invest? And Olivia, in the work that you lead on tracking access to energy finance through the Energizing Finance series, why are these efforts important for the finance community? And what kind of value would that type of activity have if we were to track financing and really understand the finance needs on access to cooling? What are your thoughts on that side and this black box that Helen talked about?
Thanks a lot, Brian. And I think black box is a perfect description, particularly for much of energy efficiency finance, actually, and particularly cooling finances. It's nascent. Let's face it. We will be building out our own work on tracking cooling finance this year for exactly that reason. Going back to the what you measure, you can work with analogy that Ben mentioned earlier. So, Brian, to answer your question. We sort of quite experienced in this. We do a lot of work on tracking finance at this stage for electricity and clean cooking. The reason we do that is to identify the volume and type of finance that's flowing to a particular segment and country. So in these cases, electricity and clean cooking and energy efficiency. Why is that important? Until we have a sense of visibility over what type of finance is flowing, how much of it and where, it is difficult to identify gaps and what needs to be addressed. So that's the primary purpose of this research. It allows us to identify trends and gaps in finance commitments for the energy sector. So what that does in turn, and sort of to address Helen's comments of a moment ago, it gives us some visibility in where money isn't going and how these problems can be addressed. So if we know that there is a problem in overall finance commitments to the off-grid sector in Madagascar, for example, we can start to look as not just a finance community, but as a policy-making community, is what is stopping that finance from flowing. And if there is a policy response to that, at least that's informed by data and what is stopping money flowing from both the public and private sectors. So it's primarily to shine a light on gaps and barriers. Clearly, and ultimately, we'd like to be able to sort of correlate good policy reform processes and good policy signals with increases in finance commitment. So we can do that by looking at countries' RISE scores, for example, their energy sectors and flows of finance over time. So this is why it's helpful to track. It has clear relevance to the cooling sector, given that there is not much data around to inform not just investment decision making, but policymakers and policy design. So that's a reason we're pursuing this work under the SE for All banner this year, in really sort of starting to shine a better light on the sector and building that out year on year to be able to identify trends and gaps, and ultimately to help policymakers, investors and other decision makers fill those gaps. So perhaps I'll stop there.
Okay, great. Thank you. So that's through the initial part of the discussion, and we've been getting a number of questions that have been coming in through the chat box and trying to bundle them a little bit. And so let me ask the first bundle of questions, which is really on private funding for large-scale agricultural cold chains and funding coordination. So maybe I'll direct this one to Alan. What's your view about private funds that aim to deliver large-scale cold chain solutions on a commercial basis? And with the unlocking of finance for cooling, how can we prevent overlap and not finance the same project? So those two really about, this funding coordination and, private funding for large-scale agricultural cold chains.
Okay, to do my best with the second question first. I wish we had more worries about overlap because the reality is the funding has so far been so limited that there really haven't been too many concerns of that nature. But I do think that the effort of the Climate Investment Platform, where you hope to have more exchange between different sources of climate funding, will be part of the answer to that. And I also think that the NDC process and the cooling action plans will similarly, because of their country level overview function, help to identify where countries are and are not getting funding. The first question is actually really one of the most challenging that I think we have right now, because we really don't have great commercial models to do it. It's the whole process of cold chains for rural farmers is really maybe the single most important in terms of the number of people that are affected in the developing world, because as we know, in many countries, particularly almost all of sub-Saharan Africa, the majority of the population are small rural farmers. And they're critical as climate change impacts productivity to feeding people. And right now we're losing tremendous amounts of food through rotting and the inability to deliver it to markets. The same is true of fishers. And there's perhaps no single issue that encapsulates the combination of economic, social, environmental development benefits than finding ways to do it. Here again, I think one of the answers has to be innovation, piloting, and learning as rapidly as we can. And one of the efforts that is quite exciting is the concept of community cooling hubs, which is being developed. I'm not sure, Helen, if KSUP seems to be behind almost everything, so I assume, but don't know that you have a hand in it. But it's essentially an effort to combine different, to aggregate different types of cooling needs so as to overcome the problem of very small, dispersed, and uneconomic end uses. So for example, combining food storage with medical needs and applications, and finding ways that through perhaps village scale systems, and perhaps combining it with solar power, combining it even with charging cell phones. People are really looking at all kinds of opportunities to integrate services. So I think that's both on the one hand encouraging, but also a reflection of how early we are in finding great solutions to this problem.
Great. No, very, very insightful answers, and leads a bit into the next question, which I have, bundled a couple here for Helen, and it's this a bit of this cool hub, but also, to what extent are we seeing cooling as a service, as a business model moving forward? The ability to have ESCOs that are able to bundle cooling appliances, and who are the investors that are looking at that, and where do we see this as a strong opportunity for increasing access to cooling and sustainable cooling?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. We certainly think that cooling as a service is one of the most exciting models. Just a disclaimer that it's not a program that I personally lead on, but I do hear a lot about it. And I think the real value in it is that it can be applied in a lot of different contexts. So to take one example from the access to cooling work, and Alan already mentioned fisheries being a key cold chain need, these sort of very small scale artisan fisheries. We work with WWF in a few beach management units, which are very small communities in Kenya and Tanzania, and they don't currently have mechanical cooling solutions that allow them to take full advantage of the market available. There's also a conservation issue because there's overfishing in order to try and have a minimum viable amount of product going back into the market. There's a lot of wastage, just fish rotting as it comes in. And so that project has identified almost a community cooling solution. It's not a hub in terms of covering different types of cooling, it's just for the fishing. But the question is, how can that be financially sustainable aside from the capital cost that we're funding of the unit? And so cooling as a service there could be as simple as, you know, the fishermen, and if they are all men, pay, you know, a fee on an ongoing basis, which would be pretty small, but in aggregate covers the running cost of this. And therefore, it, you know, once KSEP has stopped funding there, it's still going to be an ongoing product. So that's one example. Another example, on the other side of a huge industry, might be the hotel industry. Obviously, with coronavirus, the hospitality sector has been really laid low. But as they come back to, you know, hopefully as we emerge from lockdown and they try and regain profitability and get back on their feet, there's an opportunity there if they do need to upgrade their systems for cooling as a service providers, who may or may not be ESCOs. I think I normally see ESCOs as being linked to utilities, and these might be more private companies, but whichever way it is, that could be a way for them to, you know, regain their liquidity quickly, which is going to be the issue, start to recoup costs up front, and then over the long term, by paying the service fee, smooth out over the capital costs, which have been covered by the cooling as a service provider. So in terms of which investors looking at this, I don't really have sight of that, but certainly it's something that's really applicable across a lot of different scenarios.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Helen. So looking at time, we have time for one more question, which is to Olivia, really more on the energy finance side. You know, how would you evaluate the opportunity for fundraising for cooling initiatives integrated with energy access projects? And the comment is, it seems like there's a lot of synergies. So what are your thoughts on that?
Thanks very much. It's a great question. Look, off the top of my head, there do seem a lot of synergies. We're looking at an analogous issue in health, I guess, in the response to the current situation. So we're looking at energy access and what can be leveraged from a certain intervention. So what are the co-benefits of that intervention? So I would like to think that we could look at this as a whole instead of in discrete pieces. And I'd sort of use the energy and health issue as an analogy.
Thanks so much. And I want to thank everybody. You know, we've come to the end of the hour, and thanks to Ben for leading through the slides. There he is. And for the panel here to adding their incredibly useful insights, and hopefully we can really push the ball forward on this financing, you know, access to cooling moving forward. And for the remaining questions, you know, certainly feel free to continue to reach out to us at the coolingforall@sc4all.org email address, and we will certainly look to answer questions that have gone unanswered so far. So thanks for all the comments and questions. So with that, have a great day.